My name is Captain Olivia Reyes. I'm 29 years old. I've served in the Army for 7 years, and 4 months ago, I walked through the arrival gate after a 9-month deployment overseas, scanning the crowd for my parents' faces. They weren't there. My younger brother's charity golf tournament was happening that same weekend, and they'd decided without ever telling me directly that it made more sense to be there instead. The person who was waiting for me at that gate, a man I hadn't expected to see at all, ended up telling me something that changed the way I understood my entire 9 months overseas, and eventually the way my parents understood exactly what they'd missed. Before I get into it, if you've ever come home from something hard and looked for faces that weren't there, this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely read every single one. I should tell you about my family first, because none of what happened at that gate makes sense without it. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the older of 2 kids. My brother Derek is 26, 3 years younger than me, and for most of our lives, our family's attention had a fairly predictable center of gravity. Derek was easy to be proud of in a way that photographed well a growing sports management business, a wide social circle, a calendar full of events with his name on the sponsorship banner. I joined the Army at 22 right after college. And I want to be honest that my parents were never openly unsupportive of that choice, but their pride in it always felt slightly abstract to them, something they mentioned to acquaintances more comfortably than something they actually understood or asked me detailed questions about. I deployed 9 months ago to a forward operating base overseas, part of a logistics and security unit, supporting infrastructure projects in a contested region. I won't go into the operational details, but I want you to understand that it was a genuinely difficult deployment, long stretches of tension punctuated by moments that still show up in my sleep some nights. I called home when I could, roughly every 2 to 3 weeks, brief calls, my mother mostly filling the silence with updates about Derek's business, his upcoming tournament, a new sponsor he'd landed. I told myself that was simply how my family processed distance-filling space with the parts of life that felt manageable, rather than the parts that felt too big to hold from thousands of miles away. 3 months before I was scheduled to return, my unit received word that our homecoming would include a small formal ceremony at the base standard for units returning from an extended deployment family, and press invited a brief recognition event before the more private reunions began. I called my parents to tell them the date the moment I had it, genuinely excited for the first time in months, picturing them standing at that gate. My mother's response when I finally reached her 2 days later was warm, but distracted. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. We'll figure out the details." I didn't think much of the phrasing at the time. I should have. 6 weeks later, my mother mentioned almost in passing during another call that Derek's annual charity golf tournament, the one that had grown over the past 3 years into a genuinely significant regional fundraiser, had been scheduled for the exact same weekend as my homecoming ceremony. "It's just such bad timing," she said. "Derek's worked so hard on this one, it's the biggest sponsor turnout yet. But don't worry, we'll be there in spirit, and we'll celebrate properly once you're settled back home." We'll be there in spirit. I want you to notice that phrase the way I noticed it standing in a supply tent thousands of miles from home. Not an apology. Not a plan to split the day or send Derek alone to represent the family at his own event while they came to mine. Just an assumption stated gently that my homecoming was the more flexible occasion of the two. If you're already feeling something tighten in your chest at that sentence, stay with me because it gets more complicated before it gets resolved. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one. The day of my homecoming arrived a bright, cold morning at the base. Families gathered along a rope line, kids holding handmade signs, the specific electric energy of a crowd waiting for people they love to walk through a gate. I scanned that crowd from the moment we were released from the buses, looking for my parents' faces among the others, and I didn't find them. What I found instead was a man in a full-dress uniform standing slightly apart from the family crowd, a colonel, someone well above my own rank, watching the gate with an expression I couldn't quite place. His name, I would learn within the next few minutes, was Colonel Marcus Hale. And he wasn't there for any of the reasons I initially assumed. Captain Reyes. He said once I'd made my way through the initial chaos of the crowd extending his hand. I've been hoping to catch you the moment you came through. Do you have a few minutes? I told him I did, still scanning the crowd out of habit, still hoping to spot my parents somewhere in the mix. I flew in specifically to meet you, Colonel Hale said, and something in his voice shifted into something quieter, more personal. My son is Sergeant Ryan Hale. He served under your command for the last 4 months of your deployment. I remembered Ryan immediately, a steady, quiet 23-year-old from Minnesota, one of the soldiers I'd come to trust completely over those difficult months. 4 months ago, the colonel continued, there was an ambush on a supply convoy. My son's vehicle took a direct hit and caught fire. I understand you were the one who pulled him out under continued fire and got him stable enough to survive transport. His voice caught slightly. I flew here today specifically to meet the person who brought my son home to me. I want to pause the story here because I need you to understand what that moment actually felt like standing at that gate. I remembered that night clearly, one of the worst of my entire deployment, and I remembered Ryan's face in the moments right after more than I'd ever fully processed since. What I hadn't expected was for his father to be standing at my own homecoming, having traveled specifically to find me. I wanted to meet your family too, Colonel Hale said, glancing past me at the thinning crowd. I wanted to thank the people who raised someone capable of doing what you did that night. I told him as evenly as I could manage that my parents weren't able to make it that day. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of confusion that settled into something more careful. I see, he said. Well, I hope you know whatever the reason what you did for my family deserves to be known by yours too, whether they're standing here or not. If you're wondering what you would have felt in that exact moment hearing a stranger travel across the country specifically to thank your family for raising you while your actual family was 3 states away at a golf tournament, I want to ask you directly. What would you have said to him? Tell me in the comments because I still don't fully know if I said the right thing that day. I called my mother that evening, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Mom, a colonel flew here today specifically to thank our family for what I did overseas. He wanted to meet you and Dad. There was a long pause. That's wonderful, honey. I wish we could have been there. How was Derek's tournament, did you hear? I think it went really well. I want you to sit with that response the way I had to sit with it standing alone in the base parking L still in uniform. My mother had heard in the same sentence that a colonel had traveled specifically to honor what I'd done, and her very next thought moved directly back to Derek's golf tournament, without a single beat of hesitation in between. I didn't say much else on that call. I told her I needed to go, and I hung up, and I sat with something that felt less like anger and more like a long overdue clarity settling into place. I want to tell you what I did over the following weeks, because it matters just as much as that day at the gate. I didn't call to demand an apology. I didn't send an angry message laying out everything I'd been carrying for years. I simply let some distance settle in, quieter than usual, answering calls a little less quickly, offering shorter updates than I normally would have. If you've ever pulled back from someone not out of spite, but simply because you finally stopped performing closeness that wasn't being returned, you understand exactly what those weeks felt like for me. 6 weeks after my homecoming, something happened that neither Colonel Hale nor I had planned. Derek called me genuinely excited, mentioning that his tournament's growing sponsor list now included a Veterans Charity Foundation and that the foundation's regional director would be attending his upcoming fall fundraiser as a keynote guest. He asked if I wanted to come, mentioning the director's name almost as an afterthought. Colonel Marcus Hale, now serving on the foundation's board since his retirement earlier that year. I want to pause here and tell you honestly, I almost didn't go. Part of me didn't want to sit through an event that so clearly mirrored the one my family had chosen over me months earlier. But another part of me, the part that had spent 7 years learning to walk directly into difficult rooms instead of around them, decided I wanted to see how this particular room would unfold. I arrived at the fall fundraiser with my parents, who had this time made the effort to attend, genuinely proud of Derek's growing event, mingling easily among the sponsors and local business owners filling the country club ballroom. I hadn't told them Colonel Hale would be there. I hadn't fully processed until I saw him across the room that he had no idea this was my family's event either. Colonel Hale spotted me within the first 20 minutes, and I watched recognition cross his face, followed quickly by something more complicated once my mother, standing beside me, extended her hand for an introduction, completely unaware of who she was meeting. "Colonel Hale," I said, "these are my parents, Linda and Frank Reyes." I watched something shift behind his eyes, a specific, careful stillness. "Reyes," he repeated slowly. "You're Olivia's parents." My mother, still smiling, still entirely unaware, said, "Yes, we're so proud of our daughter." Colonel Hale was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "I flew across the country a few months ago specifically to meet you both," he said finally, his voice measured but unmistakably direct. "Your daughter saved my son's life during an ambush overseas. I wanted to thank the people who raised her. I remember standing at that gate watching every other family reunite with their soldier, and I remember Olivia telling me her own parents couldn't make it." My mother's smile faltered. "We had a prior commitment that weekend. Derek's tournament, actually this same event in its earlier years." Colonel Hale's expression didn't soften. "I understand schedules conflict," he said. "But I want you to understand something clearly as someone who has now stood in 2 different rooms with your family. I have met very few soldiers in my career with the composure and courage your daughter showed that night. I flew across the country because I wanted her parents to hear that directly from me. Instead, I found an empty space where you should have been standing." Derek, who had wandered over mid-conversation, went quiet, his expression shifting as he pieced together what was actually being discussed. "Wait," he said slowly. "This is about Olivia's homecoming?" That was the same weekend as my first tournament with an actual sponsor list. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected Derek's reaction to be quite what it was. I had braced myself for defensiveness, family loyalty closing ranks the way it usually did. Instead, my brother looked at our parents with something that looked genuinely like discomfort. "You told me you couldn't make my event that year either because you said you'd already committed to Olivia's homecoming. Did you actually go to hers, or did you just tell each of us the other one was more important?" My mother didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. My father, quiet as always, finally spoke. "We thought we could make it up to her afterward. We didn't realize what that day actually meant." I spoke next as evenly as I could manage. "It wasn't just a homecoming, Dad. It was the day I found out someone traveled across the country to thank you for who I turned out to be, and you weren't there to hear it." Here's where things stand now. My relationship with my parents remains genuinely complicated, though something has shifted since that evening. My mother has slowly started asking more detailed questions about my service questions that go beyond the surface-level updates she used to offer instead. My father called me a few weeks later, quieter than usual, and told me plainly that he'd spent years assuming Derek needed more visible support because his path looked more fragile, while mine looked steady enough to handle being set aside. It wasn't a full repair. It was at least an honest admission. Derek and I are closer now than we've been in years. He's made a point at his most recent tournament of personally introducing me to sponsors and guests as his sister, the captain, rather than simply as family in the background. Colonel Hale and I have stayed in touch, and Ryan, now fully recovered, sent me a message a few months ago, simply thanking me again, his father having told him the whole story of that country club evening. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. The people who genuinely see your worth sometimes have to travel the farthest to say so, and sometimes it takes a stranger standing in an empty space where your family should have been to finally make that absence impossible to explain away. If this reminded you of a homecoming, a milestone, or a moment when the people who should have shown up chose something easier, instead share this with someone who'd understand. Tell me, in the comments, have you ever had someone outside your family recognize your worth more clearly than the people who raised you did? And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.